Yes.
You can hear me. All right, I am your teacher this morning. Going to be picking up where we left off last week with continuing in the book of Acts. We will continue this through the month of September, and then we will be finishing up with Acts 28 on the last Sunday of September. And I don't think a follow-on for the last 2 months has been selected yet. So Acts chapter 25. Paul appeals to Caesar. There we see Paul in chains. From what I've read, it's believed that he was about 60 years of old at this time. And then we see Festus, Agrippa II, and Bernike, his sister there. And they're hearing Paul in this great hall with all the dignitaries present. So what we covered so far, the beginning of the church there at Pentecost, and then the problems that the earlier Christians had with teaching at the temple. And then we move on to the conversion of the first Gentiles by Peter, and then the calling of the person who was persecuting the Jews, Saul of Tarsus, who later became one of the greatest teachers and apostles. And we went with him through 3 missionary journeys, first with Barnabas, and then following on with that with Silas and Timothy. He completed his 3rd missionary journey around Acts chapter 20, and then he was returning to Jerusalem, bringing the collection for the saints in Jerusalem. He was advised by many in the return that don't go to Jerusalem because bad things are going to await you there, including a prophet by the name of Agrippus, but he felt that he had to go there anyway. So while in Jerusalem, while on the temple grounds, he was seen by some Jews, interestingly enough, not local Jews, but Jews from Asia. This was around the time of Pentecost, so there were Jews from out of town, and they recognized him and said, "This is the man causing all the problems." And a riot starts, and they were beating on him. But Paul gets rescued by the Roman tribune there with the soldiers and kept in custody. And when it was revealed that there was a plot against him, the tribune sent him with heavy guard to Caesarea, to the Roman governor Felix there, and they have a trial for him there. The Jews come up, but nothing comes of it. And then Felix keeps him in custody for about 2 years, speaking to him often. So that's where we left off. Last week, the high priest and some spokesmen come up from Jerusalem to Caesarea to lay some charges against Paul, stirring up riots and profaning the temple against Paul, but they can't prove the charges. And Paul denies the charges and saying it's only because of a Jewish issue, belief in the resurrection of the dead, that they went after him. That's why he's accused. But Felix says he hears them, and he's going to put the case on hold until the tribune Lysias comes to Caesarea. And as far as we know, there's no record of him doing that. So Paul is kept in custody because of his desire to do the Jews a favor. But Paul is given some liberty while there. He can visit friends and that sort of thing, or friends can come and visit him. And Felix, curious, he hears him often, it's said, but we don't know how often. But he's also hoping that Paul would give him a bribe or some money to get out of custody. So apparently he feels that Paul does have some money available, or does have some access to money. So today's lesson, Acts 25, essentially we're going back 2 years. Today's lesson, again, the high priest and others come to Caesarea to lay charges against Paul to the governor Festus. So it seems like in this 2 years, nothing has happened, and we're just going back to where we were 2 years ago. Only thing has changed is we've got a different governor. So let's look a little bit at the two governors. Felix, the first one for 2 years, and then Festus, who will be the governor for today's lesson. Felix, the Roman historian Tacitus writes about him and really has nothing good to say about him. He says he ruled without any fear of repercussions from Rome, and he was a very cruel man to the Jews and others. Felix practiced every kind of cruelty and lust, wielding the power of a king with the instincts of a slave. But Felix was actually born a slave, and as a young man was a slave, and then he was later freed and rose in power to become the governor of Judea. Tacitus says, Felix was unable to control all the chaos in the Judean province over which he was appointed. He tried to quell the insurrections, but Josephus says he only made things worse. The situation degraded to the point where Jonathan was the high priest, and he was in Rome, and he persuaded Claudius to make Felix the governor of Judea, which he did. Hopefully he would be a better governor than the previous one, Cumanus, but that didn't turn out to be the case. So Jonathan actually went against Felix, and then Felix ordered him to be assassinated by the Sicarii, those henchmen that carried those large curved blades. Then after the death of the Roman Emperor Claudius in the year AD 54, Nero then became the emperor, and then he'd had enough with Felix and then replaced him with Festus. Another thing that happened after the death of Claudius and Nero became emperor. Nero was actually a good emperor for the first 5 years. It was after that that he became bad. But after the death of Claudius, the Jews that had been expelled from Rome were allowed to come back. We know that from when we read about that from Aquila and Priscilla. Jews can now come back to Rome and be a part of the church in Rome again. We know very little bit about the man Festus beyond what's in the book of Acts. Outside the New Testament, he's only mentioned by Josephus, who appears to be largely favorable toward Festus's short rule. He ruled from 56 until 62 when he died. So he was not replaced, he just died. And generally that's a good thing if the historians don't write about you, because generally they only wrote bad things about you. And if you're not mentioned, then you did a good job. His predecessor Felix was excessively harsh toward the Jews, and then Nero removed them for his violent response to a Jewish uprising. Josephus states that after Nero put Festus in, the Jews weren't happy enough with just having Felix fired. They sent a delegation to Rome demanding that Nero punish Felix in some way for all the atrocities. But Felix had a brother in Rome who was very influential with Nero, so nothing became of that. These conflicts with the Jewish leaders might explain why Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, because he had such a bad reputation with them. The least he could do was leave Paul in prison to placate the Jews. Felix needed all the Jewish mercy he could get. And then Festus, knowing what Felix had done, he also did the Jews a favor. It never hurt to do that. Paul's imprisonment under both of these governors was marked by politics and corruption, yet it was key in sending Paul to Rome to preach the gospel. What looks like a legal can of worms tainted with the odor of corruption is the unfolding of God's plan. we saw something like this in the story of Joseph, where you'd think that 10 brothers selling their younger brother into slavery in a foreign land, nothing good could come of that. But it was actually God's plan to save his people during that horrible famine that covered pretty much most of the territory at that time. So let's go on to Acts chapter 25. This is from the English Standard Version. Now, 3 days after Festus had arrived in the Judean province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. And the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul, and they urged him, asking as a favor against Paul that he summon him to Jerusalem, because they were planning an ambush to kill him on the way. Now, we learned several things from these 3 short verses. One is that Festus is not a man that messes around. He doesn't procrastinate like Felix did. 3 days after arriving there, he goes to Jerusalem to meet the people there. Festus had been on a long trip coming from Rome to Caesarea. That takes quite a while. And you would think he'd spent maybe a month or so getting settled in, but he was there for only 3 days. And then he goes to Jerusalem to meet with the leaders there. And it also tells us that even though Paul was essentially out of contact with everyone, he was under house arrest for 2 years, wasn't causing any problems to anyone. The Jews still had it in for him. They did not want him to live. So even though Festus is spending a little amount of time in Jerusalem, one of the items at the top of their agenda is for Paul, to become and tried and executed. And they ask a favor, thinking, hey, this is a new guy. Maybe we can convince him to bring Paul down to Jerusalem. And another thing that's telling here is they planned on killing him on the way, indicating that they really didn't think that they had a good case on him. And this new governor might actually let him go rather than, sentence him anything. So just in case they were planning an ambush to kill him on the way, that could very well backfire on them, because, Paul's not just coming down by himself. He's going to have a large escort, and they could likely, the people wanting to kill him, they could likely be killed. Or if they found out that this was the case where the Jews were complicit in it, they could get in trouble themselves and not achieve their objective of going after Paul. So we see quite a bit of doing the Jews a favor in the book of Acts. Going back to Acts chapter 12, this is Agrippa's father here, Herod Agrippa I. In Acts chapter 12, he laid violent hands on some, had James, the brother of John, beheaded, and then he saw that it pleased the Jews. So he did the Jews a favor and arrested Peter also, and was going to kill him after the Feast of the Unleavened Bread was over. So here's the first case of doing the Jews a favor by one of the rulers. And then Felix, when 2 years had elapsed, Felix doing nothing against Paul, he was succeeded by Porcius Festus, the ruler we're going to have today, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, he left Paul in prison. So unfinished business. He was just going to pass the buck. Today, chapter 25, verse 9, Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me? So a lot of doing the Jews a favor here. So but this wouldn't have been the first attempt on Paul's life. Even when he was Saul, there were attempts on his life. I have several of them listed here. Shortly after Paul becomes a Christian, you remember he was going to Damascus there to actually arrest Christians. He had a warrant from the high priest to the synagogues in Damascus to bring Jews back in chains. But after he becomes becomes a Christian there, they were after him. The Jews were after him. They know he's in Damascus. They got all the gates guarded. And then Paul, they find out about this and they lower Paul out a window in a basket and he gets away. Shortly after he returns to Jerusalem, Paul, now the Christian instead of persecutor of Christian, the Hellenist Jews are after him. The brothers learned about it, and so they sent Paul away to Tarsus, and he stays there until Barnabas comes and gets him. On the first missionary journey, Paul and Barnabas are in Lystra, and some Jews from two previous towns they had visited, Antioch and Iconium, come to get Paul. They don't like him, so he actually gets stoned there. And those committing the act thought he was dead and then left him. And then turns out Paul wasn't dead. On I think the third missionary journey, Paul is in Achaia in Corinth, and then the Jews mount an offensive against him. All the Jews of the province speak with the governor there, the tribune, trying to bring charges on him. No, that happened early. This is in the province of Achaia. Paul is getting ready to come back to Jerusalem on board of a ship bound for Syria, and then he hears of a plot against him there. Paul's companions make the trip on the ship, but Paul himself walks to Philippi, and thereby thwarting that plot. It was thought that on board the ship they were going to kill Paul and just throw him overboard. But he hears about that. Coming back to Jerusalem, he was at the temple. He was recognized by some Asian Jews who were going after him, but this was stopped by the Roman tribune when they saw there was a commotion on the temple grounds. And then in Jerusalem, while Paul was in custody in Jerusalem, under the tribune, 40 men had taken an oath that they were going to kill Paul. Paul's nephew finds out about this, and then the tribune sends Paul to Caesarea to Felix under heavy guard. And then finally today, the chief priests and principal men want Festus to send Paul to Jerusalem, and they were going to kill him along the way. But that doesn't happen. So Festus isn't going to do this. Verse 4, Festus replies to Paul Festus replies to the Jews that Paul was being kept at Caesarea in custody, and that he himself intended to go there shortly. He spends about 8 to 10 days in Jerusalem just meeting people, and then he's going to go back there. And he says, if you want to try him, come back with me. Let the men of authority among you go down with me to Caesarea. This is about a 65-mile trip. And notice this, if there is anything wrong about the man, let them bring charges against him. The Jews are telling him, this is an open shut case. He's guilty. Basically, we just want you to pronounce sentence. But Festus lets them know that he has not made up his mind, and you got to bring charges against him, and you got to let him defend himself against the charges. After he stayed among them not more than 8 or 10 days, Luke is not certain of the time here, so he's given a range. Festus goes back down to Caesarea, and apparently the Jewish delegation does go with him. Again, see here that Festus does not waste any time. The next day, after arriving in Caesarea, Festus takes his seat on the tribunal, and then he orders Paul to appear before him. When Paul arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem with Festus stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against Paul. But unfortunately for them, they could not prove these charges that they were making against him. So they're going to learn that if you can't prove them, then you might as well not have come. Luke doesn't say specifically here what the charges are, but we get an idea what they were from when Paul makes his defense here in verse 8. So Paul then has his opportunity here in court to make his defense, which he is entitled to do under, Roman jurisdiction. So he says, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense. So really, Paul is denying all their charges. He hasn't done anything against the law of the Jews, nothing against the temple. That was the problem there when he was found in the temple. They claimed he brought Gentiles into the temple. They claimed he wasn't ritually pure when he was at the temple, but he explained there that he was ritually pure because he was there to help those men, pay the costs of those men who were taking a vow. Nor, and this would be what Festus is really would be interested in as the Roman government, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense. And as the governor, certainly Festus would know if he had committed any offense against Caesar. So they really had no charge against Paul. They couldn't even make the claim of blasphemy. Blasphemy was punished by death, and they couldn't even make that charge against him. But Festus, here we have it again, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, Paul, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me? Paul would not be very smart if he were to do that, because he remembers it was the reason he left Jerusalem in the first place was because they were trying to kill him there. But Paul said, I'm standing before Caesar's tribunal where I ought to be tried. To the Jews, I have done no wrong. They couldn't make any valid charges against him, as you yourself know very well. To the Jews, I have done no wrong, as you know. To Caesar, I have done no wrong, or you would know about that, certainly, since you're the governor. But here he's saying, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me? At this trial here, the trial is before Festus. Do you want to go to Jerusalem and there be tried before me? So what is the difference? How would that change anything? You have the same prosecution against him. The only change would be the location. You'd still have Festus acting as the judge. It's interesting that Festus says this, because back in verse 3, when Festus was making the meet and greet visit in Jerusalem, this is what they asked for at that time, and Festus disagreed to it. So why would he be asking Paul now just to make that 65-mile trip back to Jerusalem again? Paul says, if then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. So Paul here is saying, if I deserve to die because of what I've done, then my goal here is not to escape death if I truly deserve it. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, which appears to be the case, then no one can give me up to them. No one can give me up to them, especially since, and I'm sure Festus knows this, because Paul is a Roman citizen. Even the governor cannot do that. He has to be careful about that, or he can get in trouble. And then he makes his appeal. He says, I appeal to Caesar, or Caesarum appello in the Latin. So Paul sees no other recourse. He doesn't want to go to Jerusalem. He doesn't want to stay, locked up indefinitely. So he appeals to Caesar. At least this gets him to Rome, which is where he wanted to go in the first place after he had done what he needed to do in Jerusalem, delivering the gift to the church there. Then Festus, he didn't make this decision on his own, but he conferred with his own council, And they came to the conclusion, saying to Paul, to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go. So essentially, the buck has been passed again here. But once he gets to Caesar, that'll be the last thing. That's the Supreme Court. You can't go any higher than that. So Lysias in Jerusalem, when he saved him there, he passed the buck to Felix. Felix passed the buck to Festus, and now Festus is passing the buck to Caesar. And that's where the buck stops. So Paul says, no, I'm not willing to go to Jerusalem. And in doing so, demands more than the resumed trial in Caesarea. He's already been tried 3 times, there in Jerusalem, and then in Caesarea under Felix, and then Caesarea under Festus. But Paul had as much to fear from being freed as he did from being condemned, because once he was freed, he would no longer be guarded by Roman soldiers. He would be out in public, and the chances are good at that time that the Jews would hire assassins to kill Paul. So his life was in danger if he would be freed. So by appealing to the emperor, he took the case not only out of Jerusalem, out of Judea, but also out of Caesarea. And now he was assured, because he would be under guard, of safe passage to Rome to be tried by Caesar. And he would be there for quite a while, because you wouldn't automatically go to Rome and automatically be on Nero's calendar. You might have to wait a couple of years there. But there is a problem here. But Paul apparently can overcome this problem. He has appealed to Caesar. He is going to Rome, but all the costs associated with the appeal, that's the transportation to Rome, the cost of his guards, the cost of room and board, all that must be borne by the one doing the appealing. So technically any Roman citizen could appeal to Caesar for a verdict, but only the wealthy who could afford to make such an appeal could do so. But since Paul made this appeal, this was an indication that Paul did have the access to the funds that were required for this appeal. So Paul had access to funds at this time, but there was no way that he was going to use those funds to bribe Felix. But Festus, Paul has appealed to Caesar. You would think Festus would be out of trouble right now, but Festus needs some help. So Agrippa to the rescue. Paul has been condemned, or he's going to Caesar, but he hasn't been accused of anything. So how do you send someone on an appeal to Caesar if there's no charges against him? So here's a coin with Agrippa's picture on it. Agrippa II. Josephus gives us a little bit of information on this Agrippa. Thus did King Agrippa depart this life. This is Agrippa II's father. If you remember in Acts chapter 12, he was the one that had James killed, Peter locked up. But then when he returned to Caesarea, he was given a speech there in the theater, and then they proclaimed him to be a god. He's like a god. He was wearing a silver robe, and the sun shone on it, and he was resplendent, and they were calling him a god. And because he did not refuse the praise, an angel struck him, and then he died about five days later. So King Agrippa died there in Caesarea, but he left behind him a son, Agrippa by name. That's the Agrippa we're going to be reading about. He was 17 years old when his father died. And Agrippa, he had 3 daughters who were sisters of Agrippa II, one of whom Bernice, or actually Bernike. Bernike is her Greek and Roman name. Bernike was married to Herod, his father's brother, and she was 16 years old. So she was a year younger than Agrippa. And two other daughters, Mariamne and Drusilla, who was the wife of Felix. They were young, they were still virgins. The former was 10, and Drusilla was 6 years old. So she was 11 years old, younger than Agrippa. Now, when Agrippa died, Agrippa the senior died, Claudius, the emperor, wanted to immediately make Agrippa II the new king, the successor, but his advisors, Claudius' advisors, due to Agrippa's young age, he was only 17, suggested that they wait on that. So in the interim, they appointed Cuspius Fadus as the interim Roman governor until Agrippa II became of age. And we see it right here. Cuspius Fadus, he was in place for about 3 years until Herod Agrippa II reached the age of 20. So he was on the throne for quite a while before this trial of Paul. So we're about right here. So here's a family tree showing Herod the Great here. He was the great-grandfather of Agrippa II. Came down through Mariamne. She was Hasmonean. She was of the line from the Maccabees, and her son Aristobulus. These two, Mariamne was actually Herod's favorite wife. He had her strangled. His son Aristobulus, he had him strangled, causing Caesar to say, you know, it's better to be Herod's pig than Herod's son. Aristobulus' son was Herod Agrippa I, and then he had the three children, Herod Agrippa II, Bernike, and Drusilla. So at the time of this trial, Herod Agrippa was 32, Bernike was 31, and Drusilla, she was 21. She was married to Felix, so she's back in Rome at this time since Felix was recalled. Yes. Okay, and also have your Roman citizens. These three grew up in Rome, and they were, VIPs there in Rome. So it's very likely that at this trial, we have Paul, Festus, Herod, and Bernike, all of them as Roman citizens. Okay, Paul before Agrippa and Bernike. And once some days had passed, a little bit of time had passed here, Luke doesn't give us an amount, Agrippa the king and Bernike, his younger sister, arrived at Caesarea and greeted Festus. As I said earlier, he is 32, Bernike is 31, and it's believed Paul was about 60 years of age at this time. And as they stayed there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before him, saying, there is a man left prisoner by Felix. He didn't do me any favors by leaving this hot potato with me. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. Okay. I have down here Bernike. Her name is actually based upon the Greek goddess Nike, who was the goddess of victory. Now, Herod's kingdom, he's actually the king of the northern part of Palestine, but he did have control over the temple, and Agrippa was also in charge of appointing the high priest. So even though he wasn't a king of this area, he did have Rome did allow him some power with regard to the temple and the high priesthood. So he says, there's a man left prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him, thinking that this new governor would go along with it, but he had to follow Roman protocol, and he can't just condemn anyone on the word of some people without letting the person defend himself, especially if that person was a Roman citizen. And I answered them that it was not the custom of the Romans to give up anyone before the accused met the accusers face to face and had the opportunity to make his defense concerning the charge laid against them. So their plan didn't work here. They didn't fool the new governor. So when they came together here, I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. This is Festus recounting to Agrippa and Bernice what we had read earlier. Though when the accusers stood up, those Jews coming from Jerusalem, they brought no charge in the case of such evils as I supposed. From what the accusers were telling Festus, he thought, well, this is going to be some huge charge that from all the ruckus they were making, but it turned out to be not what he'd had supposed. Rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. And these are charges which really had nothing to do with the purview of the Roman governor's authority. You know, as long as they weren't causing any riots or anything like that, you know, anything against Caesar, then he really didn't care. It says, being at a loss how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wanted to go to Jerusalem and be tried there regarding them. Paul would have to be a fool to say yes to this, knowing the reception that he would get from the Jews in Jerusalem. And of course, the Christians in Jerusalem, they couldn't do anything to help out of fear of their own safety. So Paul does not fall for this. But when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear the man himself. I'm sure this made Festus very happy, because maybe he can tell Festus, you know, what to put in that letter that goes along with Paul. He would look silly sending him to Nero and not really having any charges against him. So Festus replies, tomorrow, he said, you will hear him. So Festus really moves quickly. He doesn't mess around. Now the verb here, I would like, is in the Greek the imperfect tense. And what that could mean, has Agrippa saying, is, you know, for some time I would like to hear. I've been wanting to hear about this man myself. You hardly think with, you know, Paul, with all he's been doing, and Agrippa having been king for quite a while, that Agrippa hadn't been hearing about Paul. So he finally has his chance to meet him in person and, you know, just to hear what this man is about. This reminds you a little bit, you know, Festus is bringing Paul before Agrippa, that when Pilate had Jesus before him and he finds out he's a Galilean, he thinks, oh, I can pass the buck. Herod here is in town for Herod Antipas, who was king in Galilee, says, I can send him to him. So we have from Luke 23:8, when Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him. And scripture says that after this time, Herod and Pilate, who had been enemies, were now friends. So Agrippa now gets the opportunity to meet with this person he'd heard about but had never met. So on the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp, their trumpets blowing, banners flying, everyone's wearing fine clothing. Crowds, you saw at the opening slide, the depiction of how many people were there in this great audience hall of Herod the Great there in 5 minutes. They entered the audience hall with the military tribunes and the prominent men of the city. Then, under Festus's command, Paul is brought in. And Festus said, King Agrippa and all who are present with us, you see this man about whom the whole Jewish people petitioned me, both Jerusalem and here, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. If you're Paul, wondering what's going on here, this doesn't sound too good for Paul here. But he has petitioned to Caesar, so there's really nothing that Festus can do in his power. But this has to be quite intimidating for Paul to be in this audience here. So here's the location, Caesarea Maritima. This right here is where, this is Herod's palace here, and this is where Paul would have been kept right in here. Here's that theater where Agrippa's father had addressed the crowd, and they called him a god. This is where he was struck by the angel. And then here is the great harbor here in Caesarea. And this is what it looks like today. You see, it's here's the harbor, and then this is where the palace would have been. So not much left today. Those in attendance, we have Paul. He's the main attraction here. He's the star of the show. Festus, he's the host. Agrippa, Bernice, they are the VIP dignitaries. We have the tribunes. There were five tribunes in the Roman province of Syria. They commanded the 5 cohorts stationed. So these 5 tribunes commanded 3,000 troops. So this would be their equivalent of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We got the Caesarea City Council. These are the people that Festus confers with about what to do with Paul. And then we have other important leaders, dignitaries. We have the aristocracy there. And then this really reminded me of what Paul said in his letter to Corinthians, what it must have felt like for Paul to be standing in the midst of this large crowd. And he wrote to them, he says, for it seems to me that God has put us apostles on display at the end of the procession. And if you think about it, the last person, the end of the procession at this hall was Paul. They brought him in last, like men condemned to die in the arena. We have been made a spectacle to the whole universe, to angels as well as men. I think this verse is very fitting to what Paul is encountering here in this assembly hall in Caesarea. And then Festus continues, but I found that he had done nothing deserving death. So if it wasn't for that favor to the Jews, he should have just really let him go. And as he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to go ahead and send him. But I have nothing definite to write to my Lord about him. A man that is petitioning to Caesar, appeal to Caesar, and he really hasn't done anything wrong. That's his problem. Therefore, I brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after we have examined him, I may have something to write. That was his problem. That's why he was happy to have Agrippa there. For it seems to me unreasonable, no kidding, in sending a prisoner not to indicate the charges against him, considering that I have found that he had done nothing. This is how another governor handled the problem, Gallio, the proconsul of Achaia. When he was proconsul, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal. Same thing happened here in Caesarea, saying this man is persuading the people to worship God contrary to the law. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, he doesn't even get to defend himself. Galileo says to those accusing Jews, if it were a matter of wrongdoing or some vicious crime that he had committed, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it is a matter of questions about the words and names of your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things. And then he drove the Jews from the tribunal. Wouldn't it be interesting? Wouldn't it be nice if other people, had his fortitude to do this? They didn't have valid charges, so he just got rid of them. But one advantage Galileo had that Festus and Felix didn't have was Galileo was the governor there in Achaia, and he didn't have to worry about the Jews. They were not his primary constituency. So he could deal with the Jews any way he liked. So Paul had done nothing deserving death. We have quite a few people in agreement with that. Claudius Lysias, the Roman tribune, when he sent him to Felix, he couldn't send any charges with him. Felix, the Roman governor, he's done nothing deserving death. Festus, he's done nothing deserving death. And then we'll find out next week, Agrippa, chapter 26. Paul has done nothing deserving death. If he hadn't appealed, he could have been freed. Yet, to favor the Jews, Paul remains a prisoner until he is sent to Rome. And now he's going to have to pay his own costs. Now, the appeal would have the letter that he has to send has 4 parts. Notice that an appeal had been lodged by this person. Name of the person lodging the appeal, that would be Paul. The sentence that is being contested and the name and identity of the persons involved, that would be the Jews. Part 3 is the problem here because Paul really hasn't been sentenced. So you do an appeal when you've been sentenced to something, and then you make an appeal on that sentence. But Paul has never been sentenced on anything. So how do you word the appeal when he's never even been sentenced? So that is the problem that Festus has to deal with. And I'm a couple of minutes over, but my apologies for that. But next week is Acts chapter 26, where Paul actually makes his presentation to Agrippa and Bernice. So.
Thank you, Warner. As usual, an excellent class.
Until then.
Great class,
Werner, thank you so much for taking the class for Gordon this morning on very short notice. We certainly appreciate that.
Okay. Well, I'll take next week. I don't know how long it's going to take. Actually, we don't have anybody signed up for Sunday morning. So I'll take next week.